Have you ever wondered why some things stay with you, no matter how much time passes? How a single glance, a single moment, can turn a man's life upside down. Imagine, if you will, a man standing at the threshold of everything he ever dreamed of. A man who has conquered the world in his own way, with wealth and power stretching like a horizon before him. A man who has built an empire out of ambition and work, but who, perhaps, is still haunted by something deeper, something he thought he could leave behind. Colin Langston was just such a man. At 45, he stood in his penthouse office, his broad shoulders casting long shadows on the polished floor, his eyes tracing the city that sprawled beneath him, a kingdom of glass and steel. He had it all. The company, Langston, was worth billions, a number that danced in his mind and spilled over into every corner of his life. Yet the more he held, the more he felt the emptiness that sometimes gripped him when the nights grew long and the weight of his own choices pressed too hard. His assistant, Barbara, knocked gently on the door. She had worked for him for years, a constant presence in his world of ceaseless meetings and endless transactions. She knew him, perhaps, better than anyone. It wasn't a coincidence that she understood the rhythms of his life, the rhythms that beat not for love or family, but for success, for validation in the form of contracts signed, stock prices rising, and headlines heralding his Mr. Langston, she said, her voice just a little too formal. Your dinner reservation at LeBlanc is in an hour, and the board members are on their way. Colin nodded, adjusting his tie and pulling on his jacket with practiced ease. Another night, another dinner with people who would never matter to him the way his own family once had. It was a routine now. He'd convinced himself it was enough, convinced himself he was content with this. The meetings, the deals, they were his life now. They were everything. Thank you, Barbara, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. You can go home after you leave the papers on my desk. I'll handle it from here. She lingered at the door, hesitating. There's one more thing, sir. She stepped forward, a letter in her hand. A letter came today from Carter and Associates law firm Colin froze. Carter. The name stung in his chest, unbidden, like the edge of a blade scraping at old wounds. It had been years since he had heard it. Years since he had buried that part of his life, pushed it into the dark corners of his mind. Jane Carter, the woman he had loved before he had traded everything for his empire. Just put it on my desk, he said, trying to sound casual, though his heart was thumping in his chest now. The letter trembled in his hands as he watched her leave. Alone now, Colin reached for the envelope, though he didn't need to open it to know its contents. Jane. It had to be her. He remembered her laugh, the way she would bring him coffee in the mornings when they were first married. He remembered the apartment they had shared, the small, cramped space that had felt like home when it was filled with love. It was a world away from the cold glass towers he inhabited now, and the memory of it still clung to him like a shadow. The letter was a ghost, a reminder of a time long past. The pain of losing her, of letting his ambition destroy what mattered most, pressed down on him as he gazed at the envelope. He didn't want to open it. He couldn't. It would force him to confront everything he had tried so hard to bury. With a sigh, Colin shoved the letter into his desk drawer and stood. The sound of the elevator dinged, signaling the arrival of the board members. His work was waiting. Always waiting. The restaurant, LeBlanc, was everything it should be for a man like Colin. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow on the white linen tables, where silverware gleamed as brightly as the polished floors. Waiters moved with the precision of well-trained shadows, each step calculated and measured. It was the perfect environment for business, the kind of place where deals were sealed with a handshake and a glass of expensive wine. Colin sat at the head of the table, his mind already elsewhere. He smiled at the jokes being told, though he didn't hear them. He made small talk with men and women he barely knew, their voices a distant hum in his ears. And then, just as easily as one might shift focus from a conversation to a passing thought, his eyes fell on her. There, at a table 3 rows away, was Jane. Her dark hair was shorter now, but the smile, God, the smile was the same. That smile had once been the one thing he had craved more than anything. And then there were the children, 2 girls, 1 boy, all about 5 years old. They were laughing, giggling as children do when they don't yet understand the weight of the world. The sound was bright, like a chorus of innocence, but it was not their laughter that stopped Colin in his tracks. It was the way the boy looked at him, the way one of the girls tilted her head, and the way the other girl's smile seemed almost identical to his. No, it was not just the smile, but something deeper, something raw. His blood ran cold. "They weren't just any children, Mr. Langston, are you all right?" Harold, one of the board members, asked. His voice pulled Colin from the spell he had been under. He blinked, trying to steady his breath. "I need some air," Colin muttered. His chair scraped loudly as he stood, not caring if it startled anyone. He didn't even register the stares of his colleagues as he pushed through the crowded restaurant, his legs carrying him toward that table, the table where his past sat waiting. "Colin," her voice was soft, careful, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. Jane looked up at him, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink. The laughter around them faded, the chatter evaporating, leaving just the 2 of them. "Jane," he whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. "They're mine," she answered firmly. Her gaze never left his. "They're mine, Colin." The air around him seemed to close in, thick with the weight of her words, her eyes. They were his, weren't they? He could see it in their faces. The boys' eyes, the tilt of the girls' heads, the way they moved, the way they laughed. But no, not possible. 5 years. 5 years of his life spent wrapped up in deals, in mergers, in the pursuit of something he had convinced himself was worth every sacrifice. And now, here they were, his children, his children. The realization slammed into him like a freight train. Jane's face was unreadable, but there was some pain and something else, something older. Something he knew all too well. Regret, perhaps, or maybe it was anger, maybe it was both. Her words, though, cut through it all. "You made your choice a long time ago, Colin. You chose your empire over everything else. Over me. Over us." Colin took a step toward her, but the words didn't come. His mouth went dry, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on him now. The scrutiny palpable. They were watching, waiting for him to say something, to do something. But what could he say? What could he possibly say to her, to them, after everything he had done? One of the children, Maya, he thought, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice sweet and innocent. Jane glanced down at her, her expression softening for a moment before turning back to Colin. "Just someone Mommy used to know," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes never leaving his. Colin swallowed hard, his pulse racing. The weight of it all, the years, the silence, the choices felt unbearable. How had he not known? How had he not known about them, about this life that he had missed? The truth burned through him like fire, scorching every place he had hidden his heart. All of a sudden, the empire he had built felt flimsy, fragile, like glass that could shatter with a single touch. This was what he had chosen to ignore. And now he had lost it. "We need to talk," he managed, his voice hoarse. "No," Jane said, shaking her head. "We don't. You made your choice a long time ago, Colin. You chose to walk away. This is mine now." "They are mine." Colin felt his chest tighten as the words hit him with the force of a blow. She was right in a way. He had walked away, he had chosen business, success, validation over her, over them, and now they were here, and he was nothing more than a stranger to his own flesh and blood. His children, his beautiful children, had grown up without him, without their father. But what hurt the most wasn't the anger in her words, wasn't the accusations. It was the resignation in her voice, the way she had already accepted that he was gone from their lives, that there was no place for him in their world anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe it was too late for him to try and fix it. "Jane, please," he said, stepping forward, his voice desperate. "I never knew. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was doing what was best." She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut him deeper than any anger. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would it have made a difference if you had known? Would you have chosen differently? Would you have chosen us?" Colin didn't have an answer. He didn't know. All he could do was stand there, feeling the weight of his mistakes settle around him like a cloak he could never shake off. He had been so wrapped up in the idea of success, of building something that would last, that he had neglected the very thing that mattered most, the people who loved him, the family that needed him. And now, 5 years too late, he was here, standing before them, with nothing but regrets to offer. Before he could say another word, one of the girls, Sophie, spoke up from across the table. "Can we have dessert now?" she asked innocently, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jane smiled at her daughter, her expression softening. "Of course, sweetie. Go ahead and pick something special," she said, her voice gentle. Colin watched them for a moment, the children as they eagerly grabbed the dessert menu, their small hands flipping through. Maya, the one with his eyes, was the first to look back at him. She tilted her head, studying him as though she could see right through him, as though she was trying to place him in her mind, trying to make sense of who this man was, standing before her. "What are their names?" Colin asked, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't take his eyes off them, his children, his blood. Jane hesitated, her gaze flickering between her children and Colin. "Maya and Sophie are the girls," she said softly. "The boy is Justin." Justin. The name hit Colin like another wave of realization, another gut punch. Justin was his father's name. Had Jane done that on purpose? Had she named him after the man who had shaped Colin into the person he had become? The same man who had abandoned everything for success, for power? "They're beautiful," Colin said, his voice barely audible. "They're all so beautiful." Jane's smile softened, but there was still a heaviness in her eyes. "Yes, they are," she agreed. "They're happy. We're happy," but Colin wasn't happy. He wasn't happy at all. For the first time in years, he felt the emptiness in his chest like a gaping wound. He had missed so much of their lives, and now it seemed it was too late to do anything about it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card Jane had given him. Carter and Associates. And she was a lawyer now, just like she had always dreamed. He had been too blind to see the woman she had become, too consumed by his own ego to notice how far she had come, how much she had accomplished without him. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice low. "Really talk. I want to be a part of their lives. I want to be their father." Jane's eyes hardened, and for a moment Colin saw the woman he had once known. The woman who had loved him, the woman who had tried to reach him, only to be rejected over and over again. "No, Colin," she said firmly. "You had your chance. You made your choice. And now you have to live with it." Colin didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know if he could live with it, but for the first time in years he felt something stir within him. A flicker of hope, a glimmer of something real. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The next few minutes passed in a blur, the sounds of the restaurant fading as Colin stood there, frozen, his mind reeling. The laughter of the children behind him seemed to echo in his ears, the innocence in their voices a stark contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, to manage his life with precision. But now, as he stood facing the ghosts of his past, he realized how little control he had ever really had. Jane's voice pulled him back to the present. "We can talk tomorrow," she said, her tone still cautious, still filled with that same emotional armor she had worn for so long. "But not here, not now," he nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. There was so much to say, so much to ask, but the words caught in his chest, lodged there like stones. Instead, he turned and made his way back to his table, his legs shaky beneath him, the eyes of the board members following his every move. They were waiting for him to return, to continue the business of the evening as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He sat back down, trying to force a smile, to return to the role he had so carefully crafted for himself over the years. But it didn't fit anymore. The laughter from across the room, the sound of the children's voices, gnawed at him, pulling him back to that table, to the faces of his children. It was all he could think about now. All that mattered. Harold, one of the board members, cleared his throat and made a joke, a weak attempt to ease the tension that had settled over the table. But Colin didn't hear it. His mind was elsewhere, racing back to the scene he had just left. The children, his children, how could he have missed them? How could he have been so blind? His thoughts kept returning to their faces, to the way they had looked at him, so curious, so unafraid. They had been asking questions about him, about the man sitting at the table, about the stranger who shared, and he had no answers for them. He had no answers for himself. He glanced down at the business card Jane had given him, still clenched in his hand. Carter and Associates. She had become a lawyer. She had moved on, built a life for herself and their children without him. And he had built an empire. But what had it really gotten him? What had it really given him? As the evening wore on, the faces around him blurred into nothing more than shadows, the conversations melding into a dull hum in the background. He could feel the weight of the world pressing in on him, the weight of all the years he had spent chasing success, the weight of the family he had lost. The empire he had worked so hard to build now seemed like little more than a hollow shell. The skyscrapers outside his window, the millions in his bank account, the headlines that hailed him as a success. It all seemed meaningless in the face of what he had lost. He stood up abruptly, excusing himself from the table. The others barely noticed, too caught up in their own discussions to pay him much mind. But he didn't care. He didn't care about them, about the deals that still needed to be signed, about the empire that had been the center of his life for so long. Colin walked out of the restaurant, his steps quick, his heart heavy. The cool night air hit him like a slap to the face, but it didn't clear the fog in his mind. His thoughts were still consumed with Jane, with the children. He could still see their faces, still hear their laughter. It echoed in his ears, a reminder of everything he had missed. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that the life he had built was all he needed. But now, standing in the empty streets of the city, he realized how wrong he had been. He had chosen his career, his success, over everything else, and now he was paying the price. The next day, Colin found himself standing outside the law office of Carter and Associates. He had called earlier, arranging a meeting with Jane. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but as he stood there, waiting, he felt a deep sense of uncertainty creeping over him. What could he say? What could he possibly say to her after everything? He had been too proud, too stubborn to fight for her, to fight for their family. And now, here he was, standing on the doorstep of a life that had moved on without him. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The receptionist greeted him politely, and he was escorted to a small, tidy office. Jane was sitting at her desk, her glasses perched on her nose, a stack of papers before her. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded, but not unkind. She had expected him. "You came," she said softly, her voice cool but not unwelcoming. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Colin asked, his voice rough, as though the words had been stuck in his throat for too long. For a moment there was silence between them, the weight of the past hanging in the air like a thick fog. Jane set her papers aside, removing her glasses and folding them neatly on her desk. She seemed composed, in control, but Colin could see it in her eyes, the same sadness that had been there when he had left all those years ago. "The same pain I found out about the letters," he said, his voice low. "About the calls, Barbara told me." Jane's eyes flickered briefly, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. She had tried to reach him. She had tried to tell him, but he had been too busy, too consumed by his own world to listen. "Why didn't you tell me?" Colin asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jane looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as though she were trying to find the man she had once loved, the man she had once believed in. "You never gave me the chance," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You were too busy, Colin. You didn't want to hear it. You didn't want to hear about us." Colin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. She was right. He hadn't wanted to hear it. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that the empire he was building was all that mattered. But now, standing here, facing her, he saw just how wrong he had been. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate in the face of everything he had missed. Jane didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, her gaze softening. "I know," she said, "but it doesn't change anything. We've both moved on." Colin swallowed hard. He didn't know how to argue with that, but something in his chest, something deep and primal, urged him to keep going. "I want to be a part of their lives," he said, his voice more steady now, more determined. "I want to be their father." Jane's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, Colin saw a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the armor she had built around herself all these years. "I don't know if it's that simple, Colin," she said quietly. "You can't just walk back into their lives like nothing happened." Colin nodded. He didn't expect it to be simple. Nothing about this was simple. But he had to try. He had to at least try. The sound of the clock ticking in the small office seemed louder than it ever had before, each second stretching out before Colin like a test of patience, of resolve. He watched as Jane sat back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, her gaze never leaving his. It was as if she were weighing him, measuring his worth in this moment, and he could feel it. He had been measured once before, long ago, by the eyes of men in suits and polished shoes. But now, in this room with Jane, the stakes were different. The measure was no longer about power or business acumen. It was about something he had never been good at, being present. Colin had spent years building his empire, stacking his victories in neatly organized columns. Every move was calculated, every strategy devised with an eye toward winning, toward being the best. But none of that had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for the raw, unfiltered reality of fatherhood. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly, more to himself than to her. His voice was thick with the weight of a truth he had been avoiding for too long. He had spent years running from the responsibilities that came with family, with love, with commitment. But standing here, face to face with Jane and the life they could have had, the facade he had built up around himself began to crumble. Jane didn't reply right away. Her eyes softened for just a moment before she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "You think I don't know that?" she asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I spent 5 years raising those kids alone, Colin. I made the choice for both of us. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have anyone else to turn to." Colin swallowed, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. It was the truth. He had walked away, and she had never once asked for help. She had stood alone, fighting battles he never knew about, raising their children without him. He had been so blinded by his own ambitions, so consumed by the idea of success that he hadn't even seen what was right in front of him. "They're my children too," he said, the words coming out harder than he expected. I want to be there, therefore. I want to be the father I should have been from the beginning. Jane's gaze flickered to the window, to the street outside. She didn't say anything for a long time, and Colin could almost feel the weight of her thoughts pressing against him. It was clear she was struggling, torn between the past and the present, between the woman who had once loved him and the mother who had done what she had to do to protect her children. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, more resigned. I can't just forget everything, Colin. I can't just pretend like nothing happened. You had your chance, I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know I did. And I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm just asking for a chance to be a part of their lives now. Not as a stranger, not as someone who's been absent. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment there was something like uncertainty in her gaze, something that Colin hadn't seen in years. It wasn't anger, though there had been plenty of that in the past. It wasn't bitterness, though he knew it was lurking beneath the surface. No, it was something else. Something softer. What do you expect me to say? She asked, her voice small. How can I just let you back in after everything? Colin took a step forward, closing the distance between them. I don't expect you to say anything, he said, his voice steady now. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jane. I know I don't deserve that. But I'm asking for something different. I'm asking for a chance to show you. I'm asking for a chance to show them that I can be the father they deserve. Jane's eyes searched his face as if she were looking for something, some sign, some indication that he meant it. He could feel it in the air between them, thick with the weight of her hesitation, her doubt. I don't know if I can trust you again, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Colin nodded, a small, bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I don't expect you to, but I'm here, Jane. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. For a moment, the silence in the room was all-encompassing. Colin could feel the minutes stretching out before them, each one heavy with the possibility of something new, something he had never been brave enough to hope for before. Finally, Jane stood up from her desk, her eyes never leaving his. She walked toward him, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether he would really stay. When she reached him, she stopped just short of touching him, her hands resting at her sides. Okay, she said softly, her voice steady now. I'll give you a chance. Not for you, Colin, not for us, but for them, for the children. Colin's heart clenched in his chest, the words hitting him like a prayer he hadn't realized he needed. Thank you, he whispered, the words heavy with meaning, but Jane shook her head, her expression somber. Don't thank me yet, she said, her voice firm now. This is just the beginning, Colin. You have a lot to prove. Colin looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and hope. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I will prove it to you, to them. Jane didn't say anything else. She simply nodded, her gaze shifting to the door. I have to go, she said quietly. The kids are waiting for me. Colin nodded, his throat tight. He watched as she walked to the door, her back straight, her steps sure. But before she left, she paused and turned to face him one last time. You can start by showing up, Colin. You can start by getting them used to your presence every day. And with that, she was gone. Colin stood in the empty office, his heart beating in his chest. He had a chance to be the father he should have been all along. But he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Jane had made it clear. She had given him a chance, but she was not about to hand him anything on a silver platter. She was right to be cautious, right to make him earn it. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't about business deals, about the millions he had built. This was about something different, something deeper. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. The hours that followed felt like they were stretched, strained, like he was moving through a dream that wasn't quite his own. Colin had always believed in controlling his destiny, in carefully shaping every moment to fit into the plan he had set for himself. But now, standing in the aftermath of his meeting with Jane, he felt the ground beneath him shifting, reshaping in ways he couldn't predict or control. The rest of the day slipped away in a blur of thoughts and emotions. None of them focused on the deals he had to make, the board meetings that awaited him. The empire he had built seemed a distant echo now, a pale comparison to what he had just realized he could have. And just as quickly it felt like the life he had known, his identity as a powerful, self-made billionaire, was slipping through his fingers. The next morning, as he sat in his penthouse office, the city spread out before him like an unfinished canvas. Colin knew he was no longer the man he had been. The weight of his past, the years spent running from responsibility, from love, from the very family he had built, pressed down on him with a new intensity. The letter from Carter and Associates still sat unopened in his drawer. Jane's words echoed in his mind. "You chose your empire over everything else." It wasn't lost on him that his empire, as grand as it was, had been built on the very thing he had neglected. The people who loved him, the relationships he had abandoned. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chime of his phone, Barbara's name flashing across the screen. "Yes?" he answered, his voice steady, though it belied the chaos swirling inside him. "Mr. Langston, the board members are waiting for you in the conference room. They've been asking about the status of the upcoming merger. Do you want me to reschedule the meeting?" Colin sighed, feeling the familiar weight of business, of responsibility, press in on him. For a moment, he thought about declining the meeting, about walking away from the world that had come to define him. But then he thought of the children who needed him to show up, to be there in a way that no amount of money or business success could fill. "No, Barbara, I'll be there. Make sure the room is set up." He hung up without another word, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in his stomach as he stood up and straightened his suit. The board members wouldn't care about his personal life. They never had. But Jane had given him a chance to prove that he was more than just a name on a ledger, more than the money and the power that had once consumed him. The conference room was exactly as he expected. Cold, sterile, the air heavy with the hum of anticipation. The board members sat around the long, polished table, their faces serious, their eyes keen with the promise of another deal, another win. Colin took his seat at the head of the table, his mind distant, not really focused on the conversations happening around him. He nodded when necessary, signed when expected, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the meeting with Jane. "She's given me a chance," he muttered under his breath, as though the words could somehow solidify their meaning. The meeting stretched on, minutes slipping by like sand in an hourglass. Colin couldn't focus on the figures being tossed around, the projections that meant little to him now. Every time the conversation dipped into the technicalities of the merger, his mind flickered back to Jane and their children, to the life he could have had. The question burned at the back of his mind. How could he ever make up for the years he had missed? By the time the meeting ended, his mind was so clouded with thoughts of Jane and the children that he could barely remember the numbers they had discussed, the strategies they had outlined. He rose from the table, his legs stiff, his mind foggy with the weight of what lay ahead. "Mr. Langston," Harold called, his voice cutting through the haze. "Do you have any final thoughts on the merger?" "The team is waiting on your confirmation." Colin paused, the words that should have come so easily suddenly feeling foreign. He had been a master at this, at wielding his authority with ease, at making decisions that carried weight, but now everything felt hollow. Nothing, not the millions in the bank, not the stock price that had climbed steadily over the years, seemed worth it. "Let's hold off," he said, his voice surprising even himself. "I need some time to reconsider." Harold raised an eyebrow, but didn't press him further. He nodded and made a quick exit, leaving Colin standing alone in the conference room. For the first time in years, the walls of the room felt suffocating, closing in around him. Colin walked out of the room and headed toward his office, the weight of his decision settling in. He had just made a choice, one that went against everything he had ever worked for. For years he had built this empire, stacking successes on top of successes, pushing away everything else in his life. But now, standing in the quiet of his office, Colin Langston realized something. The empire he had created, the money, the power, it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The next morning, Colin arrived at Jane's office earlier than usual. He had come to a decision, and he wasn't going to waste any more time. He had made mistakes. He knew that now more than ever. But there was something he could still do. He could show up. He could be there for his children. Jane was waiting for him in her office, her expression unreadable, but he could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes when he walked in. "Colin," she said, her voice calm but wary, "what's going on? What are you doing here?" Colin stood before her, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how to fix everything. He didn't know if he could, but he had to try. For them, for the children. "I'm done running," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "I'm done hiding behind my empire. I want to be a father. I want to be in their lives." Jane didn't say anything at first, just stared at him as if trying to read him, trying to decide if he was truly ready for what this would mean. "Okay," she said softly after a long moment, "but this isn't going to be easy. You have a lot to prove, Colin, to them, to me." He nodded. "I know, but I'm ready." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Colin had never been the type to ask for second chances. He had always believed that success, once attained, was enough. But standing there now, in the quiet office, staring at Jane's guarded face, he knew that all the wealth in the world couldn't undo the years he had lost, the moments that could never be. Jane didn't move. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of what Colin was asking. "It's a start," she said quietly, "but don't think it's going to be simple. You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," Colin replied, his voice steady now, more assured. "I don't expect that. I'm ready to work for it." For them, Jane's gaze softened, but there was still something wary in her eyes. She stood up from behind her desk, walking toward the window as if looking for something in the view beyond. Steady herself. For a moment, Colin felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering between hope and despair. When Jane turned back to him, her expression was calm, but her eyes told a different story. "They're not just going to accept you because you want them to," she said, her tone low but firm. "They don't know you. They don't even know what you are to them." "I know that," Colin said softly, "but I'm not asking for their forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to be a part of their lives, to prove that I can be the father they need." Jane's lips parted as if to say something, but she closed her mouth instead. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was enough. It was a challenge, a test of Colin's resolve. "I'll take them to the park this weekend," she said, finally breaking the silence. "You can come, you can spend time with them, but don't expect anything beyond that. Not yet." Colin felt his heart leap in his chest. A chance, a real chance. It wasn't everything, but it was more than he had hoped for. "Walar, I'll be there," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Good," Jane said, her voice softening just a little. "But remember, this is for them, not for you." Colin nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't doing this for himself, not anymore. The empire he had built, the fortune he had amassed, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was his family. The family he had neglected, the family he had let slip through his fingers. As he left Jane's office, a new sense of purpose washed over him. This was it. This was his chance. No more running. No more hiding behind the walls of his empire. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he was ready to walk it. The weekend arrived with an unexpected sense of urgency. Colin spent the days leading up to it, preparing himself in ways he never had before. He read books on parenting, on being present, on understanding the needs of children. He thought about the things he would say, the things he would do, and yet, as Saturday morning dawned, he couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that still gripped him. He arrived at the park early, long before Jane and the children, needing the time to collect his thoughts. The park was quiet, the early morning mist still hanging in the air, the soft chirping of birds the only sound. It felt like a different world, a world where success wasn't measured by the size of a corporation or the weight of a bank account, but by something much more simple, more fragile. As he stood there looking out at the playground, Colin felt a nervous energy bubbling in his chest. The children would be here soon. His children. His heart beat faster as he imagined their faces, the way they had looked at him in the restaurant, the way they had studied him, unsure of who he was, unsure of what he was. And he didn't blame them. He was a stranger to them. A man who had been absent for too long. But today he would change that. Today he would show them that he was more than just a man in a suit. He was their father. Colin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot. He turned, his heart in his throat, as Jane's car came into view. She pulled into a spot, and the children scrambled out of the back seat, their laughter ringing out in the still morning air. Colin watched them, his eyes catching on Maya, the girl who had looked at him with those same eyes. His eyes. They ran toward the playground, their small figures bounding across the grass with a kind of carefree energy that made Colin's heart ache. Maya was first to the swings, followed closely by Sophie, while Justin darted toward the jungle gym, his small legs moving with. Jane approached Colin, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the children play, her gaze following their every movement. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly, as if unsure of the answer herself. Colin nodded, though he wasn't sure he was, but he had to try, for them, for all of them. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady now. Jane turned and began to walk toward the children, her pace slow, deliberate. Colin followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He was going to do this. He was going to be there, no matter what. The children looked up when they saw him approach, their eyes wide with curiosity. They didn't recognize him, not as their father, not as the man who had been absent from their lives. But Colin didn't need them to. Not yet. He knelt down in front of them, his heart in his throat. "Hi," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Colin. I'm your dad." Maya tilted her head, studying him with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice unsure. Colin nodded, his heart breaking at the word. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your dad." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to figure out whether this was real or just a dream. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice small but firm. Colin swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her question. "I was lost," he said quietly, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Justin, who had been playing on the jungle gym, stopped and turned to face him. "You gonna play with us?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Colin smiled, his heart swelling with something new, something he hadn't felt in years. "Of course I will, buddy," he said. "I'll play with you, whatever you want." Jane stood back, watching them, her expression unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Colin could see it, he could feel it, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was home. The sound of laughter, small and pure, filled the air as Colin joined the children on the playground. They showed him how to climb the jungle gym, how to swing as high as the sky, how to skip rocks along the edge of the small pond. It wasn't much, but it was everything. In those moments, Colin forgot about the weight of the world he had carried for so long. The weight of power, of business, of success. All that mattered now was this simple, fleeting connection with the children he had never known, the children who had somehow come to mean more to him than all the mergers and stock options he had ever signed. Maya was the first to pull him toward the swings, her small hand gripping his tightly as she led him to the seat beside hers. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and hesitation. "Push me, Daddy," she said, her voice small but insistent. Colin didn't even hesitate. He stepped behind the swing, his hands steady as he began to push her, watching as she soared higher and higher, her giggles rising with each push. And in that moment, everything else fell away. There was no board meeting waiting, no stock price to worry about, no deal to close. There was just Maya, swinging through the air, her face alight with joy. Sophie, always the inquisitive one, was soon beside him, watching with interest. "Can I swing too?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Colin smiled at her, his heart swelling with a tenderness he had never known before. "Of course," he said, gently helping her onto the swing next to Maya. The two girls looked at each other, their faces lighting up with the unspoken understanding of siblings, of shared experiences. Colin pushed them both, his heart in his chest, his hands moving in rhythm as the swings creaked beneath their weight. He wasn't sure how long they played, but time seemed to stretch out, like the sun hanging low in the sky, casting a golden hue over everything. Colin was no longer the man he had been. He was not the billionaire businessman, the corporate shark who had fought tooth and nail for everything he had. No, now he was just a father who had missed too many years, but who was determined not to miss another moment. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the laughter started to slow, the energy of the children ebbing with the fading light. They climbed down from the swings, tired but happy, their faces flushed with the joy of the afternoon. Jane, who had been quietly watching them from the sidelines, stood up, brushing the grass from her pants. She walked over to Colin, her expression softening as she saw how easily he had slipped into the role of father, how natural it seemed for him to be here with them. "You did good," she said, her voice low but sincere. "They like you. They're starting to trust you." Colin smiled, the words hitting him with more weight than anything he had ever heard in a boardroom. "I'm just getting started," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll keep showing up, Jane. Every day." For them, she nodded, the smallest flicker of something in her eyes, relief, perhaps. It was hard to say, but there was something there, something that told him she was starting to believe him, starting to see that he was no longer the man who had walked away so easily. They spent a few more minutes at the park, walking slowly toward the car, the children trailing behind them, still laughing and chattering about their favorite parts of the day. Colin could see the shift in their energy, the way they had begun to look at him not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged there, in their lives. It was a slow process, but it was a process that Colin was willing to fight for, willing to invest everything he had in. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond the confines of his office, beyond the sterile walls of his empire. As they reached the car, Colin turned to Jane. "Can I take them out again next weekend?" he asked, his voice tentative. Jane looked at him, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes studying his face. For a moment, Colin wondered if he had asked too much, if she was going to push him away again, retreat into the safe distance she had held for so long. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Next weekend, Colin's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what exactly had changed, but he could feel it. A shift in the air, a softening of the walls that had stood between them for so long. She was giving him a chance, and he was going to make sure he didn't squander it. As Jane buckled the children into the car, Colin stood for a moment, watching them through the window. Maya was talking animatedly, Sophie laughing at something Justin had said. He could see the way they looked at each other, the bond they shared, and for a moment, it felt like he was finally becoming a part of something real, something that mattered more than any business deal, more than any financial. He climbed into the car, settling into the seat beside Jane. The ride back to her house was quiet, but not uncomfortable. There was a new kind of peace between them, something that had been missing for years, something that was just beginning to take root. When they arrived at her house, Jane turned to Colin as he opened the door. "We're still taking it slow, Colin," she reminded him gently, her gaze steady. "This isn't going to be easy, and you have to prove that you're ready. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for them." Colin nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm ready. I won't let them down." She gave him a small smile, the kind that said everything without needing to say anything at all. And then she stepped out of the car, her steps slow and measured, as if still unsure of where this new path would lead. Colin stayed in the car for a moment longer, looking out the window at the darkening sky. It had been a day filled with small victories, tiny moments that meant more than anything he had ever gained in the corporate world. And for the first time in a long time, Colin Langston felt something he had never known he needed: hope. He wasn't sure where this new journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain: he was going to show up every day. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to build the family he had always wanted. The days that followed were like walking on the edge of a cliff, every step tentative, every decision weighted with the uncertainty of the past. Colin knew he couldn't rush it. He couldn't expect to win over Jane and the children in a single sweep. But he had made a choice, and he was committed. Every moment spent with them was a small piece of a puzzle that he had left incomplete for far too long. The family he had longed for, the family he had failed to nurture, was slowly but surely becoming real in a way that no business success had ever been. The next weekend came swiftly, and Colin was ready. He had spent the week thinking about what it meant to be present, to show up not just physically but emotionally, to be the kind of father his children needed. He had learned from the past, learned from the mistakes he couldn't take back, but he could start again. He could start now. Jane had agreed to let him take them out again, though the reservation of caution still lingered in her voice, a reminder that they were still testing the waters. She hadn't fully let go of her guard, but there was a softness there, a small shift in her demeanor that Colin couldn't ignore. The trust was fragile, but it was there. The children had been looking forward to the weekend outing all week. Colin had noticed it in their voices, in the way they spoke about the trip with excitement, like the promise of something new and wonderful. Sophie had asked him countless questions about the zoo they were going to visit, her mind always focused on the scientific details, while Maya had been drawing pictures of the animals she hoped to see. Justin had simply asked if they could play soccer afterward, his face lit with enthusiasm. On Saturday morning, the sun was shining bright and clear, a perfect day for an adventure. The car ride to the zoo was filled with the sounds of excited chatter. From the back seat, the children eagerly discussing which animals they hoped to see first. Colin, sitting in the front, couldn't help but smile. The energy in the car was contagious, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something real, something pure. As they arrived at the zoo, Colin felt a wave of anticipation, mingled with a small sense of nervousness. This was the first time he had been out with them on his own, and he wasn't sure what to expect. He had no idea how the children would react to him, whether they would continue to see him as a stranger, or whether the connection he had felt growing over the past few days would solidify into something stronger. The zoo was bustling with families, the air thick with the sounds of children laughing and animals calling out. As Colin and Jane led the children through the gates, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was a different world than the one he had known, one filled with simple joys, with moments that couldn't be measured by the stock market or the bottom line. This was a world he had almost lost. They started at the lion exhibit, the massive creatures lounging lazily in the sun. Sophie was quick to point out all the facts she had learned about lions, their social structure, their hunting techniques, and Colin found himself fascinated by her knowledge, by the way her mind worked. Maya, on the other hand, was lost in her own world, sketching in the notebook she had brought along, capturing the lions in delicate strokes of pencil. Justin, ever the energetic one, was already running toward the next exhibit, urging his parents to catch up with him. "Come on, Daddy," he shouted, his voice filled with the same enthusiasm he had shown during their park outing. "You gotta see the giraffes," Colin smiled, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. The word daddy still felt strange on his ears, but it was beginning to fit in ways he never expected. The laughter, the joy, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. It was all there, slowly weaving its way into the fabric of his life. As they moved through the zoo, stopping at various exhibits and taking pictures along the way, Colin found himself more and more absorbed in the children's excitement. Maya showed him her drawings, explaining the details of each sketch with a kind of seriousness that belied her age. Sophie asked him about the different animals they saw, her mind racing with questions about their behavior, their habitats. And Justin just wanted to share his energy with everyone around him, racing from one exhibit to the next, pulling Colin along with him as if he were the strongest, most capable man in the world. At one point, Colin found himself standing alone by the giraffe enclosure, watching as Maya and Sophie took turns sketching the animals, their faces lit with the light of concentration. He had seen them in moments like this, in the small gestures, in the quiet times when no one was looking. He had seen the way they moved, the way they interacted with the world, and in them he saw pieces of himself, pieces he had long ignored. It was at that moment, as he watched them, that something shifted deep inside him. This was real. These were his children. They weren't just names on a page, not just faces he saw in photos. They were flesh and blood, and they were here with him now. The realization was overwhelming, and for a moment Colin felt something akin to grief. A deep, aching sorrow for all the years he had wasted, all the moments he had let slip away. But as quickly as the grief came, it was replaced with something else. Determination, resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, and he would. For them, when the day finally came to an end, as they piled back into the car, tired but happy, Colin felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had made it through the day. He had shown up, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. "Can we do this again next weekend?" Justin asked from the back seat, his voice full of hope. Colin turned to look at him, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course, buddy," he said, his voice filled with a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. "Of course." As they drove home, Colin found himself thinking about the future. He still had so much to prove, so much to make up for. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid to be present, to be vulnerable, to love in a way that he had never allowed himself to before. The world outside the car seemed distant, like something that no longer mattered. The empire, the deals, the business, it was all secondary now. The only thing that mattered, the only thing that was truly real, were the people sitting in the car with him, his children, his family. And as the sun set on that perfect Saturday, Colin Langston finally understood what it meant to be truly successful. It wasn't in the boardrooms or the mergers or the stock market. It was in the laughter of his children, in the quiet moments they shared, in the chance to be the father they needed. The days that followed the trip to the zoo seemed to pass in a blur, each one blending into the next, yet each one marked by small victories, by quiet, fragile moments that grew stronger with time. Colin knew better than to rush things. He knew that trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But for the first time, he felt as though he had taken the first steps toward something real. He had chosen his family, and while that choice wasn't perfect, it was his. And that, he knew, was the beginning of everything. Jane had been cautious with him, her words still measured, her actions still careful. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to allow him to sweep back into their lives and pretend that everything could be fixed with a few good gestures. And Colin didn't expect that. He didn't expect anything from her beyond what she had already given him: a chance to prove that he could be more than the man he had been, a chance to be the father his children deserved. The weekend after the zoo outing, he invited the children to his new home. The house was a far cry from the penthouse that had once defined his life. It wasn't the sleek, modern structure that spoke of power and wealth. It was warm, inviting, and most importantly, it had space. Space for laughter, space for memories, space for his children. When they arrived, Colin could see the curiosity in their eyes, the way they looked around at the rooms, the way their little feet padded across the wooden floors. Maya ran into the living room and immediately began sketching the view of the garden outside, her quiet concentration. Sophie found the bookshelves and began pulling out books on science, flipping through the pages with wide eyes, while Justin, full of energy, was already outside in the yard, chasing after a soccer ball. It was the first time Colin felt something close to contentment in years. They were happy they were here, and he was here, truly here, with them. Later that afternoon, Jane arrived to pick up the children. Colin watched as they said their goodbyes. As Maya handed him a drawing she had done of the house, Sophie waved enthusiastically, and Justin promised to come back soon to play soccer. It was in those small moments that Colin understood something that had always eluded him. Success was never about what you could accumulate, but about what you could give. And what he had to give now was time. Time to make things right. As Jane turned to leave, her eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something between them. Maybe it was just the softening of old wounds, or maybe it was the acknowledgement of the new ground they were treading on together. Whatever it was, it wasn't lost on Colin. He knew that Jane was still guarded, still uncertain, but she was allowing him in, little by little. The next week, Colin made a decision. He was done with the empire, done with the late nights at the office, the endless meetings, the constant grind of business. He wasn't walking away completely. He couldn't, but he was taking a step back. He had to. For his children, for Jane, for himself. He sat in his office, looking out over the city, the skyline stretching before him like a sprawling labyrinth of glass and steel. It had been his world, his everything, but now it felt like something he couldn't even touch anymore. The numbers on his screen, the emails, the endless calls, they didn't matter. He picked up his phone, dialing Barbara's number. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice professional, but with the subtle note of familiarity that only came with years of working together. "How can I help you, Barbara?" Colin said, his voice steady but filled with something else. "I need you to clear my schedule. No more back-to-back meetings. I need to delegate more. I need to focus on something else. My family. And I'm going to need you to handle the transition for me. You'll have to manage more in my absence." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, a hesitation that told him she knew this was more than just a passing thought. "Of course, Mr. Langston," she replied. "I'll make the arrangements." Colin took a deep breath, feeling a weight he didn't realize he had been carrying begin to lift. The world outside his window hadn't changed. The empire, his empire, was still there. But for the first time, it no longer held his heart. He had been so focused on building it, on filling the emptiness inside him with success, that he had forgotten what it meant to be truly alive. He wasn't going to do that anymore. The following weekend, he invited Jane to meet him at a small cafe one that was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would expect a billionaire to frequent. There were no crystal chandeliers or polished marble floors. There was just the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the soft, warm light of a setting sun filtering through the window. Jane arrived, her expression guarded as always, but there was a slight softness in her step. She had accepted his invitation. And for the first time in a long time, Colin saw the woman he had once known. Strong, but open. She sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. "What is this?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You don't strike me as the cafe type." "I'm not," Colin admitted, his voice light. "But I thought it was time to do something different, to stop pretending that the world outside matters more than what's right in front of me." Jane raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what's right in front of you, Colin?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, his eyes steady as he met hers. "You, the kids, my family, and for the first time, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not going to run. I'm going to show up every day, and I'm going to be here for you, for all of you." Jane was silent for a long moment, her gaze never leaving his. And then, slowly, she nodded. "I believe you," she said softly. "But you need to understand something, Colin. This isn't about making grand gestures. This is about being consistent. This is about showing up for them. For us." "I know," he said, his voice firm. "And I'm ready." As they sat there, talking about the future, about the children, about how they would navigate this new chapter together, Colin felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He still had a lot to prove, not just to Jane, but to his children. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The empire would still be there, waiting for him when he was ready to return. But it was no longer the center of his world. Family had taken that place, and he wasn't going to let it slip away again. When the conversation ended and Jane stood to leave, she hesitated. For just a moment, their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, Colin saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. "Thank you, Colin," she said quietly before turning to walk away. Colin stood there, watching her leave, a sense of gratitude filling his chest. It wasn't over. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and that, he realized, was more than he had ever had. He walked out of the cafe and into the soft evening light, ready to face the future, ready to fight for his family. The following days were slow, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see whether Colin Langston's promises to himself and to his family would hold. Colin, for his part, threw himself into the life he had so long neglected. He spent every available moment with his children, learning the rhythms of their days, their joys, their frustrations, their small. He found himself sitting through science fair projects, helping Sophie build makeshift volcanoes out of baking soda and vinegar, while Maya painted in the corner, her bright colors spilling onto the paper like they had spilled into his heart. And Justin had him running after soccer balls every chance he got, showing him the new moves he'd learned in his league, all the while chattering about the things that mattered most to him. Colin reveled in it, the small moments, the moments he had ignored for so long, thinking he was too busy, too important to stop and listen. Now, each laugh, each question from one of the children felt like a gift, one that he hadn't earned but would fight to keep. Jane, too, seemed to soften in her approach. She had always been wary, and that wariness didn't just disappear with a few good days. But there was a shift in the way she looked at him, a slight lightness in her eyes when she saw him with the children, when she saw him showing up, not just physically, but emotionally, in a way that he never had before. The walls were still there, but the cracks were starting to show. Slowly but surely, she was beginning to trust him again. And that trust, though fragile, was a lifeline he clung to. That Thursday, Colin met Jane for coffee. It was a small thing, but it was progress. She had asked him to meet her at a quiet cafe, far from the bustling streets of downtown, a place where they could talk without the world watching. He arrived early, his mind restless as he waited. He wasn't sure what they would discuss, whether it would be about the children, about the future, or perhaps just a moment of calm in the storm that had been their lives. When Jane arrived, she looked different, more at ease, her shoulders no longer stiff with the weight of old grievances. There was a small smile on her lips as she sat down, a smile that was unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. "Colin," she said, her voice calm, "I've been thinking." Colin set his coffee down and leaned forward slightly. "About what?" His voice was gentle, his heart thudding in his chest, the anticipation of her words making him anxious. "About you," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness that made his stomach tighten, "and about us." About the future. Colin held his breath. This was it. This was the moment where he either continued to make progress, or fell back into the same patterns he had always known. He had come so far, but he still feared that old habits would pull him away, that the man he had been, the man so focused on success, would surface again, and it would all fall apart. "I want to be clear with you, Colin," Jane said, her voice steady. "The children, they've started to trust you, but it's not just about them. It's about you proving that this isn't temporary, that this isn't just another phase where you want to fix everything and then walk away when it gets hard." Colin nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't blind to the fact that trust took time. He wasn't asking for a shortcut, wasn't asking for forgiveness overnight. He had a long road ahead, and he was ready to walk it, slowly, patiently, with every step measured. "I understand," he said quietly. "I know I've let you down, Jane. I've let the children down, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." She watched him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for something, anything, that would tell her he meant it. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening just a little. "I know you're trying," she said, the words coming with a heaviness that seemed to settle between them, "and that means something. But I need to see consistency, Colin. I need to see that you're not just doing this because it feels good right now. I need to see that you're in this for the long haul." "I am," Colin said, his voice filled with conviction. "This is where I belong, Jane. With you. With the kids. With all of you." She nodded slowly, as though weighing his words against something deep within herself. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "Okay, but you have to understand one thing, Colin. This isn't just about showing up. It's about being the kind of father they deserve. And that takes more than time. It takes love, it takes patience, it takes sacrifice." "I know," Colin whispered. "I'm ready to do all of that. I've spent too many years running from what matters." "I'm not running anymore." For a moment there was a long silence between them. Jane studied him with a quiet intensity, her thoughts clearly far away. And then, as if a decision had been made, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I believe you," she said quietly, her voice filled with something softer than it had been before. "But remember, this is for them, not for you. You've already chosen what you want." Colin smiled, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He didn't need anything more from her, not yet. Not after everything they had been through. All he needed was this small sliver of belief, this small step toward trust. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Jane stood up, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned to leave. As she walked away, Colin watched her go, a sense of peace settling over him that he had never felt before. It wasn't the peace of a man who had everything, but the peace of a man who had finally found what mattered most. The rest of the afternoon was quiet, but Colin felt a shift within himself. The life he had once clung to, the empire, the business, the deals, seemed distant now, Not because he had abandoned it, but because he had discovered something that could never be replaced. He had his family now, and that, he realized, was more than enough. The weeks drifted by in a way that felt both slow and swift, each passing day bringing Colin closer to the reality he had only dreamed of. Time with the children became a new kind of routine, a rhythm that was unfamiliar yet satisfying. Sophie, Maya, and Justin continued to surprise him with their innocence, their curiosity, and their love. They didn't know what had been lost, and in a way that made it easier to move forward. They weren't bogged down by the past. They simply accepted him as he was now, as their father, the man who was showing up. And Jane. Jane was still careful, still cautious, but Colin could see it. The way she would watch him when he interacted with the children, the way she would soften ever so slightly when he made an effort to be present, to be there in the way she had always needed. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. They were finding their way, one step at a time, with each conversation, each quiet moment, each shared glance between them. It wasn't the fairy tale he had imagined in his youth, but it was real. And that was enough. One Sunday afternoon, Colin took the children to a local park, the kind of place where families gathered and spent lazy afternoons. They played soccer, Maya sketching the trees and flowers nearby, Sophie asking a million questions about the stars, and Justin simply enjoying the moment, running and laughing with his siblings. It was all so simple, so natural, and it filled a void in him he hadn't even realized was there. The park was crowded, the sun beating down in golden rays, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like freedom. Colin sat on the grass, watching them, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself just breathe. He let go of the need to constantly fix, constantly strive for something bigger. He didn't need anything more than this. The sound of their laughter, the sight of them playing together, happy and carefree. After an hour or so, they sat down together on a patch of grass beneath a tall oak tree. Maya handed Colin a picture she had been working on, a drawing of a tree with 3 birds flying above it. She smiled shyly as he took it from her, studying it with a deep, genuine interest. "This is beautiful, Maya," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You really have a gift," she beamed, her small cheeks flushed with pride. "It's you," she said, pointing to the tree, "and Mommy." And me. The birds are us, flying together." Colin's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the drawing, at the birds above the tree, and he saw it. A symbol of something he hadn't dared to dream about just months ago. Together. All of them. A family. "That's exactly right," Colin said softly. "Together." Sophie leaned in, her eyes alight with the thrill of knowledge. "Daddy, when are we going to the Science Museum again?" "I want to learn more about space." "I'm going to be a scientist. I'll take you," Colin said, ruffling her hair. "We can go anytime you want." Justin was off again, his energy boundless, as usual. He kicked his soccer ball in the air and then chased after it, laughing as he sprinted across the field. Colin smiled, watching his son run, his heart full of pride. "I want to play soccer with you, Daddy," Justin called, his voice bright with excitement. "You can teach me all the cool moves." Colin stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, buddy. Let's do it," he said, walking over to where Justin stood. "But you better be ready. I'm going to show you some of my moves." Justin laughed and took off toward the soccer field, and Colin followed, his steps light, almost youthful. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for these moments, for the chance to be the father he had always longed to be. As he kicked the ball with Justin, as they played together under the sun, Colin realized that the life he had once fought so hard to create, the empire, the wealth, the success, wasn't his true legacy. This was. The laughter, the joy, the quiet moments with his children. This was the real success. When the day ended and the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, the children piled into the car, their voices tired but happy. Colin drove them back to Jane's house, feeling that same peacefulness, settle in his chest. He was here. He was present, and that was enough. As he parked the car outside Jane's house, he looked over at her. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her expression thoughtful but calm. He could see the way she was watching him, the way she was beginning to trust him again. It wasn't easy for her, he knew that, but she was letting him in, one small step at a time. He reached out and touched her arm lightly. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was still hesitation in her gaze, but there was something else there, too, something that had been missing for a long time. "You're doing good," she said quietly, her voice soft. "They're happy. They're starting to see the real you," Colin smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm not perfect," he said softly, "but I'm here, and I'll keep showing up." Jane didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him, her eyes searching, as if weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "I know, and that's enough for now." Colin felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from success or wealth. It wasn't the kind of peace he had once sought in boardrooms or mergers. This peace was different. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that he was finally where he needed to be, with his family, with his children. As they got out of the car, the children ran toward the front door, chattering excitedly about their day. Colin stood with Jane for a moment, watching them go, the weight of the world suddenly feeling light. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly be free. And in that freedom, he found something more precious than anything money could buy. The passing days, weeks, and months were no longer defined by the ticking of a clock or the shifting of meetings on his calendar. Colin had learned to embrace the slowness of life, the moments of stillness that, in the past, he had dismissed as trivial. He had once been consumed by the rush, by the pursuit of goals that never seemed to bring him true fulfillment. Now, those quiet moments with his children, with Jane, became his measure of success. It wasn't about the headlines anymore, the deals that garnered praise and admiration. It was about the small, everyday things, holding Justin's hand as he practiced his soccer drills, seeing Maya's wide eyes light up when she showed him a new drawing, watching Sophie lose herself in a book she was reading about the stars. There was peace in the simplicity of those moments, and for the first time, Colin could hear the subtle rhythm of his life without the clamor of ambition drowning it out. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat on the front porch of the house Colin had recently renovated for their family, Jane sat beside him, sipping her coffee. The children were in the backyard, their voices rising in laughter as they played a makeshift game of soccer. The soft breeze rustled through the trees, and Colin let out a deep sigh. There was a quiet contentment in his chest, a feeling that he wasn't sure he had ever truly known before. For so many years he had focused on acquiring more, on conquering the next big thing. But now everything that mattered was right here, within these walls, within the reach of his children's laughter. The empire he had built no longer felt like a victory. What felt like a victory now was his ability to simply show up day after day, to be there for his family. Jane set her coffee cup down on the table beside her and turned toward him. "You know," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking." Colin raised an eyebrow. "About what?" She looked out at the children, her eyes following their every move as if trying to absorb every moment. "About what we've built, about how far we've come." Colin smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible smile. He knew exactly what she meant. They had come a long way, from the fractured pieces of their past to the tentative but real beginnings of a future they could build together. And though there were still scars from the years they had spent apart, there was something in the way they moved now. A mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that they had finally found their place in each other's lives. "I think we're doing okay," Colin said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Better than okay, actually." Jane looked at him, her gaze piercing but gentle. "We've learned a lot, haven't we?" Colin nodded slowly. I've learned more than I ever thought possible." There was a long pause between them, as if both of them were taking stock of everything they had gained, everything they had lost, and everything they had yet to understand. Then, slowly, Jane spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You're a good father, Colin, a better one than I could have ever imagined. I wasn't sure at first, but now I see it. I see you, really see you. And I see the way the kids look at you." Colin's heart swelled at her words, but he didn't respond immediately. What could he say? Words had failed him for so long. But in that moment, he didn't need to say anything. He just reached over and took her hand in his, a silent promise passing between them. The children came running toward the porch, their laughter filling the air, and the moment slipped away, slipping into the folds of memory. But Colin knew something now that he had never known before. His life was richer, fuller, because of them. The children, Jane, his family, were his success, his greatest achievement. And with that realization, Colin Langston stood up, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders just a little more. He stepped toward the backyard, joining Justin as he kicked the soccer ball around, his heart light, his spirit full. The months passed, but the steady rhythm of family life never faltered. Colin made a promise to himself, to Jane, to the children. He would never take these moments for granted again. Every meal they shared, every bedtime story, every weekend outing, they were treasures, and Colin knew, with every fiber of his being, that he would cherish them all. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the house filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and simmering stew, Colin looked at his family and felt something stir deep inside him. It was an emotion he hadn't experienced in so long. A quiet joy, a contentment that didn't require anything beyond this. "You know," he said, as the children eagerly dug into their plates, "we should plan a trip, somewhere special, maybe the mountains or the beach, just the 4 of us, or 5 of us," he added with a wink, glancing at Jane. She smiled, the hint of warmth in her eyes. "I think that sounds like a good idea," she said, her voice steady. "We could all use a break, a chance to just be." And just like that, Colin knew that they were becoming more than just a family by name. They were becoming a team, learning to navigate life's challenges together, finding joy in the little things, and holding on to the moments that made life worth living. A year passed, and things began to settle into a new normal. Colin continued to spend his days focused on his family. He had made some small adjustments at the company, but he wasn't consumed by it anymore. His role as a father, as a company parent, as a partner, took precedence over everything else. The empire he had built remained strong, but Colin no longer found his identity in it. His identity, he realized, was now rooted in his family. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Jane turned to Colin and said, "I don't think we've ever had a perfect family, but this is ours, and it's enough." Colin smiled, his heart full as he looked at the 3 children. His children, Maya, Sophie, and Justin, were sitting on the grass, their small figures bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Colin could hear their laughter, their voices drifting up toward him. And in that moment, he understood. This was enough. This was everything. In the quiet stillness of the evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Colin knew that he had found something far more valuable than anything his empire could ever offer. He had found home, and as the night deepened, as the sounds of family surrounded him, he smiled, because for the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't about what you could build, it was about what you could love. Thank you for watching this story on Shoe Stories. If it moved you, taught you something, or made you rethink the meaning of silence, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters. Let it be heard quietly or loudly, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos showing on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and unexpected. We'll see you in the next one.